Seek, strike, and destroy. That was the motto of the U.S. tank destroyer battalions during the Second World War, commonly seen in the black cat patch used by those units. This illustrates the doctrine behind these vehicles, with their intended use being to intercept and destroy enemy tanks as opposed to waiting for them to come to you. With this doctrine in mind, a design would have no need for excessive protection at the cost of low speeds, but rather something exceptionally fast and packing the firepower to match. While this can be seen in many different tank destroyers during the war, no doubt the pinnacle of this design philosophy is our topic today, the M18 Hellcat. Before we discuss the story of the M18 though, I want to give a quick thanks to the sponsor of today's video, World of Tanks. World of Tanks is a free-to-play online vehicle combat game featuring hundreds of tanks and other armored vehicles, including the M18 Hellcat. Face off against your enemy in a heavily armored beast like the Mouse, or support your team using long-range artillery or a well-concealed tank destroyer. I've played World of Tanks for years, and between the regular game modes, I have also enjoyed many of the special event modes they run throughout the year. They are also a big supporter of members of the US and Canadian military through their Salute program, which allows both veterans and active duty military members to get access to extra free content in the game, including discounts and a free premium tank. However, if you aren't a military member, you can still get a kickstart to your World of Tanks experience using the link below and code COMBAT to get access to the premium Tier 6 Cromwell B, 250,000 credits, 7 days of premium time, and 3 other premium tanks as rentals for 10 games each. If you've played previously and want to get back into the game, you can also use the code to instead get 3 days of premium time, a special 2D style, and a 7-day rental of the Centurion Mark V/1. Thanks to World of Tanks for their support of this channel and the men and women serving in tanks and other military roles. Now let's get back to discussing our main topic. To fully understand the design process which eventually led to the M18, we need to first travel back around 7 years before the first prototypes of what would eventually become the M18 Hellcat were delivered. The reason for this is that in 1936, the US Infantry Board would create the first set of characteristics for a vehicle which would closely resemble later US tank destroyer designs. While not a tank destroyer, and in fact it predates the tank destroyer branch itself by several years, this marked one of the early attempts by the US military at producing a sort of tank support vehicle, and indeed tested it to see its capability in an anti-tank role. This development would be rapidly sped up by the creation of 53 tank destroyer battalions, as well as the shifting of existing anti-tank battalions into tank destroyer battalions. However, for the Hellcat, the most important part of this was the creation of the Tank Destroyer Tactical and Firing Center led by Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Bruce. This would not just be in charge of developing the doctrine for existing and future tank destroyers, but also the development of those future designs. At this point, many of the tank destroyers being fielded consisted of half-tracks such as the M3 gun motor carriage, but this would soon change. The design and introduction of the M10 tank destroyer not only somewhat resembles the attributes of the earlier M2-based design mentioned earlier, but would be the first to actually enter service. The M10 itself is deserving of an entire video of its own, but for the purposes of this video, we will briefly discuss some of these characteristics. The first of these is obviously the open-top turret, which was done for several reasons. For one, it improves visibility for the crew, but it also helps to keep the fighting compartment free of fumes or smoke from firing the gun. Secondly, while it was built on the M4 Sherman chassis, it had its armor protection reduced, allowing for a lighter weight than the original Sherman. Finally, it featured a more powerful 3-inch or 76.2mm gun than its Sherman cousins, making it far deadlier in its intended role against enemy armor. While it does share some general characteristics to the M18, the M10 was primarily an expedient solution to the need for a tank destroyer following the US entering World War II. The problem with the M10 in the eyes of now General Bruce was it only marginally improved in mobility over the Sherman. In order to solve this, a new platform was needed, and indeed, another was already in the works. The development path, which would eventually lead to the M18, actually began slightly before the design process for the M10, beginning November 7th of 1941, 18 days prior to the T-35 project, which eventually progressed into the M10 GMC with the T-35E1. This alternative design, called the 37mm gun motor carriage T-42, was to be a modified version of the T-9 light tank armed with, you guessed it, a 37mm gun. It should come as no surprise that the idea of a 37mm gun as a main armament for a tank destroyer in late 1941 quickly was thrown out, replacing it with the more powerful 57mm, and with that we come to the next stop in our journey to the M18. The next tank was known as the 57mm gun motor carriage T-49. While many aspects of the design are still far from the M18, already some similarities can be found, primarily in the running gear. However, it would be the next tank, the 75mm gun motor carriage T-67, where we finally reach the true predecessor to the Hellcat. Featuring an open-top turret armed with the 75mm M3 cannon, this design would be the final step towards the design known as the T-70, which would become the M18. While the testbed for this design was little more than the T-49 prototype hull with a new turret slapped on top and the bow machine gun removed, there were few changes left in order to reach the conclusion of this development process, which had now been ongoing for over a year. Which finally brings us to the T-70. With our journey to the M18 finally reaching its destination, we also reach the question of what did the US actually get for all that time spent. Taking aspects of the previous designs leading up to it, the 76mm gun motor carriage T-70 featured a lighter version of the 76mm gun with 45 rounds of ammunition. Finding an exact fire rate for the vehicle has proven difficult, with the only concrete information I can find being a Soviet test giving it a maximum of 11.4 rounds per minute. The only other number I could find was 20 rounds per minute, which is an uncited claim in the Wikipedia article, so I cannot verify the validity to that. As for the hull, it was redesigned to accommodate the Continental R975C1 9-cylinder air-cooled radial engine. With the larger radial engine now taking up the space in the rear, the transmission and final drives were moved to the front of the vehicle. The turret was also redesigned to mount the 76mm, finally being given a protrusion in the rear to act as a counterbalance for the gun, creating the recognizable shape of the M18's turret. The suspension and running gear were also altered massively, switching from using coil springs on the previous designs to now relying on torsion bars. As for armor, there isn't much to say, as there wasn't very much on the vehicle. While it did have a good amount of angling along the whole front, with only half an inch of armor, or 12.7mm, it wasn't going to stop much besides shrapnel or small arms at longer range. The turret was not much better, with the thickest point being between 3/4 and 1 inch thick, 19 to 25.4mm. Although this thin armor did result in less protection for the crew, the light weight of under 20 tons allowed the T-70 to reach incredible speeds. According to the manual, this should be limited to a maximum of 55 miles per hour or 89 kilometers per hour, but the true top speed the vehicle could achieve was even higher. This made it quicker than all its potential foes and even its own allied forces, which actually led to some problems in combat, as we will discuss later. As for the crew, the tank destroyer was to be operated by a 5-man team. 2 men would sit in the hull front, acting as a driver and assistant driver, with the remaining 3 being in the open-top turret, performing the duties of gunner, loader, and commander. Roughly 1 year after the very first wooden mock-up of the T-49, the first prototype of the T-70 would be completed in April 1943, shortly followed by an additional 5 for a total of 6. These 6 tank destroyers would be tested at both the General Motors Proving Grounds at Camp Hood and Aberdeen Proving Grounds. While these did find some problems with the design, overall they performed well, being placed into production by the Buick Motor Car Division of General Motors in June of 1943. From the initial testing, alterations to these production vehicles included shifting the gun 2 inches to the right of the center line of the vehicle to give the gunner more room, and the addition of a second shock absorber alongside the existing one on the first road wheel to reduce the speed of wear. Rapid wear was also a concern in regards to the tracks, leading to a series of improvements to resolve that issue. In yet another display of the United States' immense manufacturing capabilities, the production quota of 1,000 vehicles by the end of 1943 was fulfilled in January of 1944, meaning from the time of the first prototype to 1,000 production units was barely 8 months, and by the time production ended in October of 1944, that number had jumped to 2,507. To put this in perspective, the entire production run of the Japanese Chiha, which was one of their most produced tanks of the war, was around 2,100 and took them from 1938 to 1945. As for the Germans, a fairly comparable design to the M18, the Martyr III, saw around 1,700 units produced from 1942 to 44. While production numbers alone do not make a vehicle great, and a number of other factors including how many vehicles were ordered vary by vehicle, it is still incredibly impressive how quickly the US was producing vehicles not just in large quantities, but ones with excellent quality and reliability. The T-70 would officially become the M18 in March of 1944, being standardized as the 76mm gun motor carriage M18. The first units would begin to arrive to troops in the field during the spring of 1944 in Italy. However, a problem quickly arose. The crews didn't want them. Given it had good firepower and better mobility than anything else the US was fielding at that time, what caused this? Well, it came down to a few factors, which you can probably guess. One of these was the fact that up to that point, the crews had been serving on M10s in North Africa as well as the Italian front. When you combine the inherent bias we humans have towards what we know with the fact that the new replacement featured significantly thinner armor without any significant increase in firepower, it's understandable why they may have been a bit hesitant towards the M18. This was not the only concern though, as being an entirely new design also brought with it the unavoidable fact that it was new to everyone, and because of that, both Axis and Allied troops had yet to see it in the field. With the M18 featuring a muzzle brake, larger road wheels, and a hull shape that looks somewhat like the German Panther, the chances of friendly fire increase dramatically. One method used to help prevent this was to not only show troops what the new vehicles looked like, but as we see from this image, the muzzle brakes of at least some M18s were painted red. Due to most photos being black and white and a lack of further information, we cannot say how many had this done or for how long, but we do know that it was done. The T-70 was briefly considered as a light tank for the US Army as a whole, but due to the limited protection, this did not progress further. It was not just the US forces who were initially unimpressed with the M18 either, with the Soviets having a similar disinterest towards potential lend-lease of the tank destroyer. This was for more than just the lack of armor protection, although that is noted as a concern. The other factors leading them to not want it were high fuel consumption, poor off-road performance, and the fuel it used causing it to be more fire-prone. Before you rush to spread these around as reasons for the M18 actually being a terrible vehicle though, bear in mind that the environment the Soviets were fighting in, as well as their doctrine, was different from that of the US. So while some of these, such as not using diesel fuel, thus being more fire-prone, are valid concerns, other flaws, such as the vehicles being unable to effectively tow similar weight vehicles, or the loader's position being cramped, were either non-issues under US doctrine, or were resolved through changes to the vehicles. It should also be noted that the Soviets pointed out a number of good characteristics about the T-70, including its reliability, gun characteristics, and comfortable positions for most of the crew. The example they received was a very early production T-70 as well, meaning many of the early upgrades had still yet to be introduced. While the M18 would not see service on the Eastern Front, it would see widespread use in the West as well as some use in Italy and the Pacific. The first of these, as mentioned earlier, would be given to troops in Italy as the Normandy landings had yet to occur and user feedback on the designs was highly desired. Much of this feedback, as we have already discussed, largely echoed the concerns put forward by the Soviets. Light armor, difficulty in mud, and poor placement of the ammo racks were all found to be problems with the design. Even the smaller size of the M18 compared to the M10 led to concerns about the crew space being more limited. This would lead to the commander of the 894th Tank Destroyer Battalion to not deploy them alongside their M10 cousins, rather utilizing them as part of the reconnaissance company where they reportedly performed well. This hesitation towards putting the M18 into combat persisted even to the Normandy invasion, with only 3 of the 19 self-propelled tank destroyer battalions in England being equipped with them. This was not just due to the lack of armor or other factors we have already mentioned, as much as a hesitation towards introducing a new vehicle type into an already complex operation. This same hesitation is partly responsible for the US lacking the more powerful armaments on their Shermans during the Normandy landings, which is without a doubt one of the biggest mistakes made during the early invasion of Europe. As the war progressed, we can see the somewhat icy reception of the M18 begin to thaw. While the light armor remained an ever-present concern, as the more powerful panzer types were encountered more and more frequently, the potential benefits granted by the M10 grew fewer. Some of these are expressed by a Hellcat commander by the name of Sergeant Joseph Tetrell, who heaped praise on the tank destroyer. He even brings an interesting point up regarding the armor protection of the M10 and M18 against German guns, stating, "Unless we have at least 10 inches of armor on our tanks, we may just as well not have any armor more than 2 inches. He then goes on to say the lighter armor of the M18 actually was better in that regard, as the thinner armor would result in less fragmentation than the thicker armor of the M10, leading to an overall better outcome when hit. This praise was not without criticism though, as despite the fast speed of the Hellcat, its actual mobility was found to be similar to that of other vehicles alongside it. In fact, in some cases, shortages of M18s saw knocked out vehicles replaced by 76mm armed Shermans, which could reportedly keep pace with the M18s under battlefield conditions. I caution against taking this as gospel truth though, as various other accounts note the M18's superior off-road capabilities, with it crossing terrain where M4s instead bogged down. The speed did in some cases prove to be an issue, however, as M18s could easily leave their supporting recon and security units behind. This problem with outrunning their supporting forces did result in an interesting proposal though, a fully M18 powered unit. The theory for this was to create multiple variants of the M18 to have a full platoon made up of them. These variants included a command recon vehicle, an armored personnel carrier, an armored ammunition carrier, an armored prime mover for artillery, a general purpose carrier, and one with an anti-aircraft mount. In the end, this idea would not result in a fully M18 powered platoon, but the existence of the M39 armored utility vehicle does give us a glimpse into what may have been. Other improvements to the M18 based on feedback from the crews were attempts to add additional armor to the tank destroyer, as well as some sort of roof for the turret to prevent grenades from easily being tossed in, as well as to keep the weather out. Other complaints were made regarding the 50 cal mount and the fact that the commander needed to fully expose himself to enemy fire in order to operate it. This led to a variety of experimental forms of protection, including a hinged dome and a conical cover, but none of these were adopted. The largest of these modifications, though, was the T7 swimming device to allow M18s to perform water crossings. By using floats, side skirts, LVT-style grousers, and even a gun stabilizer, this would give the M18 both amphibious capabilities, as well as granting them the ability to fire effectively while doing so. This and some other similar designs created later did achieve success in their goal to make the vehicles float, but were not used in combat. Back to their combat use, the M18s would see good success during the Battle of the Bulge, where they got to fulfill their intended purpose of rapid response to armored breakthroughs. In this, they reportedly performed well, with the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion reaching and supporting the 101st Airborne Division. The 705th's M18s successfully prevented German armored advances, knocking out many of the German panzers at the cost of a relatively few Hellcats. This is, in essence, exactly what the updated tank destroyer doctrine called for, with the TDs being employed to halt the advance of enemy tanks by supporting infantry. By doing this, they reinforced the infantry while also gaining the benefits of having those infantry protect them from enemy infantry. To fully discuss the tank destroyer doctrine and its many flaws would take far too long to include in this video, but if you would like to learn more, I recommend reading Seek, Strike, and Destroy, U.S. Army Tank Destroyer Doctrine in World War II, which will be linked below. Nicholas Moran also has a number of videos discussing tank destroyers and doctrine on his YouTube channel, The Chieftain, which are worth watching if this is a topic you find interesting. The performance of the M18 in the European theater generally appears to have been fairly good. It still struggled with the heavier armor of the newer German panzers, but thanks to the mobility, they could still knock them out by flanking them. As for their limited use in the Pacific, this appears to be a bit less impactful. Tank destroyers in general were of little use in a theater where the most heavily armored tanks were already easy pickings for the Shermans. With the suicidal anti-tank tactics utilized by the Japanese, the open top and thin armor of the M18s also placed their crews in far more danger. I should note though that I was able to find one report which echoes the praise for the M18's mobility we see from the European theater. While it doesn't mention it by name, referring to a self-propelled 76mm gun, the description leads me to believe this is almost certainly referring to the M18, and the M18 is mentioned by name later in the report. It reads, and I quote, "The SP 76mm gun proved to be the most mobile self-propelled weapon on the battlefield. Its relatively lightweight, maneuverability, and low silhouette proved very successful. The enemy did not succeed in knocking out any of these weapons in the 77th Division. Those located by the enemy were quickly shifted before they could be hit." While it certainly performed well, there is no denying that the M18 was lacking in firepower for a tank destroyer by the end of the war. A short-lived project to mount a 90mm gun on the M18 did have the potential to solve this, but the war was over by the time it had completed testing. If you'd like to learn more about that vehicle, I have covered it in a previous video. The end of World War II would not mark the end of the M18 in combat, although it would not be used by the US forces in the war in Korea, with only the M39 utility vehicles being used. Several nations would end up taking M18s for themselves though, with the Yugoslavian, Bosnian, Serbian, Italian, Greek, Venezuelan, Iranian, and Taiwanese militaries all receiving some. M39s were also used by several other nations, with the West Germans, Japanese, and Netherlands receiving small numbers of them. Out of all of these, the only ones to actually see combat are those within the Balkan nations. These were used in a variety of strange ways, including as part of an armored train by Serbian forces and as part of the infamous M18 T-54 hybrid created by the Bosnians. Other odd modifications were made to keep these aging vehicles in service, such as the ones you see on screen. Another attempt to keep them in service was done by Taiwan, who mounted the M18 turret on the hull of a Duster anti-air vehicle. The last of the notable variants of the M18 is the modernization made by a company in Venezuela during the 90s. The engine was swapped to a diesel, with it also receiving night vision equipment and a thermal sleeve for the 76mm gun. This vehicle is commonly known as the M18A2, but it is unclear how many of these were actually built. The legacy of the M18 is a bit of a strange one in the world of armored vehicles. While it certainly is not a failure, I'm not sure if we can consider it an outright success. We cannot blame it for the shortcomings of the doctrine it was placed within, but the question still remains: was it really necessary? While at the time of its introduction, it did feature more firepower than the standard M4 Sherman, as more 76mm armed Shermans arrived, its firepower advantage was nullified and the mobility it had remained its sole advantage. The introduction of the M36 furthered this, as now there was a competing tank destroyer which packed a bigger punch. Perhaps the M18 armed with a 90mm could have proven to be an even more capable machine, but we will never know. In my opinion, I think the M18 was a vehicle somewhat ahead of its time, which caused it to be put into a somewhat awkward position. Just a few decades after World War II, we began to see vehicles with a similar premise to the M18, where firepower and mobility were prioritized over armor with tanks such as the Leopard 1. While I would not go as far as to say the M18 was some sort of early main battle tank, I do have to wonder if it might have been viewed more favorably by all if it had come about in a post-war world. Either way, while you could make a somewhat compelling argument for this to have been an episode of Cursed by Design, I feel that would be a disservice to the vehicle and crews, which when combined proved it was a capable and deadly machine. Again though, those are just my thoughts, so please don't take them as factual statements. So what do you think about the M18? Let me know down in the comments below, and while you're down there, don't forget to try World of Tanks using that link and the code COMBAT to get your special starter bonus. Thanks again to them for supporting my content. It's only through support from all of you and my sponsors that I can make these videos for you full time.
Don't break shit.
I want to once again give a shout out to Nicholas Moran's book Can Openers, which is an amazing resource for the development of these US tank destroyers. Of course, as always, a big thanks to all of you for watching and to my ConelyFans who generously support my content. If you enjoyed this look into the M18 Hellcat, I highly recommend watching my previous videos on the Nashorn and Firefly, as those two vehicles show ways that other militaries tried to solve the tank destroyer question. Hope to see you there.